What we're going to be looking at today is a new system that we're working on that is not designed for the student but for the instructor. So the idea here is to give mentors or leaders of study groups a systematic way that they can pass on real skill in bouting to their own students or to their own apprentices. One thing I've noticed over time watching when people post videos bouting with their students is that the students may have the basic information of how to fight in our style, the correct guards and the correct cuts and footwork and that sort of thing, and yet not seem to know how to translate that into actually closing with the opponent successfully and winning a bout, or getting the opponent to close with you and winning a bout. So it's very difficult to teach that sort of thing if you don't have a method, because it's very difficult to teach anything if you don't have a method. So what I've been working on is a way that instructors can have a step-by-step organized curriculum for how they're going to present bouting skills to the students. And to do that, we're going to work with the concept of the 7 words. That's in the big Broadsword Academy book if you don't remember what they are, but the first of the 7 words we're going to look at is simplify. Ordinarily you would use simplify in a situation where you didn't quite know what you were facing, you were getting overwhelmed, the opponent's confusing you. You default to a very simple version of your own skill set until you can figure out what's going on. We're going to use that as our starting point for this set of exercises, where the student doesn't have any idea what's going on, they've really just started bouting. So instead of coming in there and throwing everything you've got at them and hitting them with all this stuff they have no chance of blocking, instead what you want to do is establish that they do know how to parry correctly in our system and how to try to hit you correctly in our system using nothing but the basic attacks and parries. So you should tell the student in this exercise that they are not to attempt anything other than parrying and attacking. You will not attempt anything other than parrying and attacking. If that's all either of you do, and if the student is really ready for bouting, nobody will hit anybody. If the student makes an error and attempts to do something more sophisticated, or just doesn't correctly parry, then your attack will hit them. The ideal here though is that neither person will hit the other one. If that is happening and happening consistently, you can then move on to the second phase. So we're going to take a look first at that simplify. All I'm going to do is attack and parry. All Matt is going to do is attack and parry. This is not like the doubling exercises because you're not restricted to lunging and shifting in place. You can move anywhere you want, but the attacks have to be basic and the defenses have to be basic. Now, that was a little fast and furious. The beginning student may not be able to handle going quite that fast, but you adjust it to the individual student. So let's say he's probably not comfortable with that level of intensity. It might look like this. That's fine. You don't have to get all intense on it. Main point is that you want to establish this student knows how to parry, this student knows how to cut. Once you've established that the student knows how to do that, you can go on to the second phase. So, the next phase is based on the second word that we're going to look at, which is wait. The waiting strategy, which we also call predatory defense, is where you pretty much concentrate on your defensive. You don't so much worry about trying to push the offensive against the opponent, and you wait for him to do something that gives you an opportunity to strike, such as making the mistake of trying to cut for your legs or making an overly wide attack. So to teach the student the skill of wait, which is the single most important tactical skill in our arsenal, what we're going to do is the instructor is going to just continue to make simple basic attacks, nothing else. The student has permission to use timing attacks. Timing attack is where you cut the opponent while he's doing something. So Seth may cut me while I'm changing my guard, or he may cut me while I'm trying to make an attack. He can cut me when I'm advancing. Anytime I change something and he suddenly cuts, that's a timing attack. The other thing is that I am now going to add in the possibility of making leg cuts. Shifting counter against a leg cut is also a timing attack. So Seth's job here is to learn how to use the waiting strategy effectively. All he has to do is defend himself with his parries, throw basic attacks back against me, and if I make an attack that is a little bit broad enough that he thinks he can get a timing attack, he can go for it. And if I go for his legs, he can shift and counter. Now, if the teacher is just making basic attacks and defenses, and the student is using timing attacks, the student should win the bout. If the student tries to do something else, tries to get clever and do something other than timing, then you punish them for the mistake by hitting them, and then they lose the bout. So what you want here is a situation where if the student does the correct thing, the student will win. But if the student makes mistakes and is not doing what you want them to do, the teacher will win. So basic attacks, defenses, timing attacks, and shifting counter. This is going to be a 4-touch bout, a 4-point bout under our tournament rules. That's 1 point for Seth. Attack, he did a shifting counter to my arm. He now has 2 points. He got my arm with a timing attack. That's 3 points. And he got my arm with a timing attack. That's 4 points. So because Seth did what he was supposed to do and used the waiting strategy, fought mostly from the defensive and looked for opportunities to time me or shift and counter, he was able to win the bout by a score of 4-0. That might make him start to feel pretty confident. Look at that, I beat teacher. So that's where you add in the second phase of this exercise, which is that I can now do the same thing. Either of us are allowed to use timing attacks. One against Seth. Seth got one, that's 1-1. Got a timing attack on Seth, it's now 2-1. He got me in the torso, that's worth 2 points, so the score is now 3-2. I got a timing attack under his wrist, score is now 3-3. And I got him in the head, that ends the bout. So, now the student sees what I'm being taught works, and it's still working. I'm landing touches on the teacher, but I realize that in fact the teacher can still beat me if he wants to, so you don't see irrational confidence developing. Alright, so the next word that we're going to look at is provoke. Now there's all kinds of different ways to provoke the opponent into making a committed attack. And you would use this strategy when waiting isn't working. Let's say there's a time limit on the bout and you really can't wait. Let's say, you know, he has reinforcements coming and you really can't wait. Let's say he's just better at waiting than you are, and you can find your mind wandering, and you're going to get hit because your mind wanders. Either way, you decide you have to abandon the waiting strategy. Now it's a little more advanced, so you want to keep your student on the previous phase where they're just doing wait and timing for quite a while. Now, only once they're really good at it do you move them on to this stage. So when you're trying to use provoke, you basically do it by making attacks that are not really intended to hit, but they're not feints either. They are what Hope calls, I think he uses the phrase, a vigorous counterfeit of a half pursuit, or something like that. So it's attacks that have some energy behind them and where you do lunge, so you are moving in the distance. They are real attacks in that sense, but you don't really have the goal of hitting, and you don't really stretch as far in as you could. Your reasoning behind this is that you're trying to get him to make a more committed attack on you, which you will then parry and riposte. So when you're teaching this skill to the student, you explain that concept, but admittedly it's a little hard to understand how to apply that without some experience. And then you start the bout, and the student is allowed to use either timing attacks or parry riposte. So they don't just have to score with timing, they can also score by blocking you and then riposting against you. The idea is that by doing this, you can teach them to try to set up situations where you're attacking so that they can parry riposte. So now we're going to try that with Matt. Now the teacher at this point in this phase defaults back to just doing basic attacks. So I'm not going to be doing timing attacks. I'm only going to be doing basic attacks and leg attacks. Matt is allowed to either time or parry riposte. Okay, Matt scored with a timing attack. That's one. That was more to my arm than anything else, so we'll call that 2. That was off a parry riposte. That was a timing attack. He has 3. And that's 4. Now, if you have the student at this stage and they don't score any parry riposte, they only score with timing attacks, then they're not yet ready to move on beyond it. They have to be scoring a substantial amount of time on parry riposte for you to decide that they're ready to move on. Once you decide they are ready to move on, then you add in where the teacher is also allowed to score on parry riposte as well as timing, etc. So he did not shift back and get out of the way. He got hit in the leg. That's 1 point for me. Looks like I've lost my head protector. That was a timing attack. Matt got 1 point, so it's 1-1. There he got a parry riposte to my torso, so he's ahead now. It's 3-1. And he wins the bout, finishing with an attack to my arm, making it 4-1. So as I was saying before, you don't move the student past the provoke phase until they're getting a substantial number of touches on parry riposte. Once they're ready to move on beyond provoke, you add deceive. Now, there's many ways to deceive, but the most basic is the feint. Feint, of course, is where you pretend to make an attack to one line without moving your foot so that you don't get any closer. And then you make your real attack to another line and you do lunge in for that one. So that's the most basic form of deceive, and that's how you're going to introduce students to the concept of using deception. So the teacher now is once again using only basic attacks and parries. The student is allowed to use timing, parry, riposte, or feints. And as with the previous phase, if they don't start scoring with feints, don't move them on yet. You only move them on when they're frequently landing feints. torso strike, he gets 2 points. And another torso strike completes the bout. Now, once he's showing that he can successfully use the feinting approach, you then make it so the teacher's allowed to do the same thing. So I'm now allowed to do everything that he's allowed to do. Like McBain's feint thrust to the face. Since that was to the mask, it's 3 points for me. He's in a lot of trouble. And his touch to the arm gives him 1 point, so it's 3-1. And he gets me on the torso, added to his 1 point previously, it's now 3-3. Next touch will win the bout. And I land a feint on his arm for the win in this particular bout. But since it did go to 4-3, he clearly does understand feinting. So he would now be able to move on to the next phase. Although, in reality, you don't make that decision based on one bout. Okay, next word we're going to look at is disrupt. Now, disrupt is a tricky strategy. For one reason is that it's quite ugly. And when you're using the disrupt strategy, people who are watching might feel that it looks very unskillful. The reason is that it has a staccato, broken rhythm, and it does not look like elegant fencing. That's okay. We don't use it to look elegant, we use it because it's effective in certain circumstances. The simplest version of the disrupt strategy is to start adding in actions on the blade. So this would be your beat disengage, your glissade, and your battering attack. So the beat, of course, is where you just tap your blade against his blade to clear him out of the way. Beat disengage is where you beat and then disengage over to the other side. Glissade is where you engage in the inside guard and then kind of spiral it in and push cut. And battering is from Page, and you literally just bash your way through his guard with brute force. So disrupt is where you're doing all of those things to kind of keep the opponent from getting into a rhythm and just continually messing with him until you get through. So the first phase of this, I'm going to be doing just basic attacks and defenses. Matt can do everything he's done up until now, but he also has to throw in disrupt, and he can't move beyond the phase until he shows some skill with disrupt. Okay, was that a beat on my sword and then a strike from my arm? Yes. That's 1 point for Matt. Two for Matt. Nice. That's 3 for Matt. That is really the essence of disrupt there, is repeated beats up near my center line and in my face, and then suddenly went low. And then he finishes it with a strike to the mask. Now, at that point, once the student understands disrupt, of course the teacher can now do the same thing. That's 3 points with a strike to the mask. A strike to the arm that he didn't call quickly enough, and then a strike to the mask. So that's that. But then once the student is able to use disrupt whenever they want to, whenever they choose to, and it's an appropriate tactic to use, then you move them on to the next phase. So now we're going to change what the teacher is doing, because we're going to look at overwhelm. Overwhelm is a strategy that's very appropriate under certain circumstances, but it's suicide under any other circumstances. Overwhelm is when you literally just try to overwhelm the opponent with raw aggression, constant attacks. You just bash your way through. You close in on them rapidly. So when would this be appropriate? One would be when one army is charging another on the battlefield, like the Highland Charge. That's obviously overwhelm. Another would be a situation where you have a disadvantage, like Seth draws a broadsword and all I have is my dirk. Well, I don't really stand any chance at all unless I get in there very quickly. So there are circumstances where you would use overwhelm. But normally, overwhelm is something that people do when they're strong and they're tough, but they're not actually very good fencers. You'll see the person come charging in with multiple attacks to multiple different angles, and if you're not ready to handle the barrage, they will win, and they will beat a lot of opponents this way, and as a result, they will generally think of themselves as being good fencers. But if you're used to it and you know how to handle it, this kind of opponent is actually very easy to beat, and you should be able to beat them pretty much every time. The way we're going to use to beat them is with enclosing command. You haven't seen any of the commands yet for a reason, and that is that if you're not in the right place to do a command, you're only going to get hit if you try it. The right place to do a command is when you're at what's called the half sorting distance. So if our weapons are crossed halfway up, that's also called close distance. At that point, you're at grappling distance and anybody can do a command. If you're not as close as that, there is no opportunity for a command. So in the 10 lessons of the core curriculum, when you see all those commands, those are not tactics to just use any old time you feel like it. They're tactics to use when the circumstance is correct for it and when the circumstance presents itself, like when an opponent is trying to overwhelm you. So the teacher is no longer going to just do basic attacks and defenses. Instead, the teacher is going to come charging in with a barrage of attacks. The student's only job is to apply a successful command from our system, such as the Turkish disarm, the lift and pommel, elbow lock, something like that. The command under our tournament rules is worth 4 points on its own. So if the student does what they're supposed to do, they'll win the bout immediately. Be somewhat careful not to injure each other on this one. Was that on camera? That was definitely a successful command, and it would count. Seth had to adapt to circumstances and wasn't really able to get one of the classic specific commands from our lessons. He did end up getting me with the pommel in the face, but it was after getting me in a different hold, not in a lift. That's okay as long as they understand the principles. But I don't want you to move your student on from this stage until they're consistently applying commands from our system, as well as other improvised commands they make up on the spot. When you see both, when you see that they can do what's in our system and they can change it when they have to, then they understand how to do it. Until then, they don't understand how to do it. Now, why don't you jump in for the next one? So, this is the same thing. I just want you to see a different person applying it. I'm going to overwhelm. Matt's job is to try to get in closing command. The student does not get a command. Make them wish they had.
I thought I can actually thrust you to the side.
If I can still move, you don't have a command. You actually missed it. Ready? That's a command. He gets 4 points, he wins the bout. Now, of course, it's going to get harder. The second phase is that the instructor can attempt to counter command. I actually just did in the previous one. And that's it. I did not in any way succeed in getting a counter command. He got me. So, when the student shows that they can successfully respond to an attempt to overwhelm them with a properly executed and closing command, they're now ready to move on to the final word of the 7 words. That's change. Well, of course, if you can change to anything you want, all you're doing is free fencing. So the last thing that you do is just a free fence. Either one of you can do anything. That's 1 for Matt. Oh, and he lands it right on my mask. He beat me 4-0. That is not something that Matt generally does, but he just beat me 4-0. Why? Because he had just gone through all of these exercises and his mind is focused on the specific tactics that will get him victory quickly. So, even with your advanced students, if you make a habit of running through all these exercises, you should start to see